And so you can hear me okay, Joe? All right, good. So this is Tuesday night, January 2nd, 2024. This is a class on the Great Dharani. It's part of a class series on traditional Buddhist chanting. And it's actually the third class that we've done so far on the Great Dharani. There'll be one more after this. Uh, at least one more. You know, there's so much to talk about in the Great Dharani. But not assuming this class will be largely self-contained. Um, and the first thing that we do when this class meets is we actually do the chant that we're going to be discussing. So right now, before any further ado, I'm going to cue up the Great Dharani. Chanting virtually is a little weird. Fortunately, we have a nice somebody, a member of our local sangha, um, recorded us chanting when we used to meet together in person. So I'm going to play that right now. I'm going to mute everybody. Okay. So I managed to, let's see, stop here. Managed to stop the recording before it went into the Jijang Bosal chant, just barely. So, like I said, this is a class on the Great Dharani, which we just chanted. I assume, other people here have experienced chanting it. One of the things I want to talk about is the history of the Great Dharani, but I always ask, and often there's not much response. Does anybody have any questions or anything they want to raise? Anything they want to make sure that we talk about tonight? And this isn't like the only chance. If at any time you want to say something, just unmute yourself and and say it. Let's see, where are we? Not this one. Trying to find. Oh yeah, here it is.
So I'll ask a question
Oh yeah,
before
sure. Go
we
ahead,
get
Tom.
started.
Great.
You said this is the third class on the Great Dharani.
Mm-hmm.
Are the others available on YouTube?
Yes. Yeah. So the others are all on YouTube. So that this class meets every other Tuesday. And we've actually been meeting since March, I think, and we'll continue through February. And that's kind of when I will run out of steam for this particular project. But the next, so probably, I said that I might extend the classes on the Great Dharani, but what I'll probably do instead is for the last series of classes after, so we'll meet one more time in January. We meet on the first and third Tuesday of every month. So we'll have two meetings in February, which were originally, we were going to go back and do Kwanzaa Bosal chanting. But actually, what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to talk more about the Thousand Hands and Eyes Sutra, which is directly related to the Great Dharani, as which is one of the things we'll talk about tonight. Because the first chant that we talked about at the beginning of this class series was the Jijang Bosal chant, which overlaps a great deal with Kwanzaa Bosal chanting. There's only a few kind of substitutions that are made, but the structure is the same, and most of the actual content is the same in between Jijang Bosal chanting and Kwanzaa Bosal chanting. Which is a really, I mean, there's actually, you can do that same structure with medicine Buddha chanting, Yaksa Yorebo or Soga. Anyway, so there's actually, I could talk about that, but I think I'd rather talk about the Great Dharani. I mean, to continue talking about the Great Dharani and bring in the Thousand Hands and Eyes Sutra, which there's a lot of stuff in the Thousand Hands and Eyes Sutra. Anyway, I'm going to share my screen now and show some. Yeah, start showing some PowerPoint slides here. Oh, the Kingdom of. Ooh, okay, that's getting a little bit ahead, just a little bit. Okay, so this is kind of the way that I've tried to organize the class tonight is in terms of a kind of a history of the Great Dharani in East Asian Buddhism. Now, and while I'm at it, let's go into slideshow mode just to. Just so I can have a laser pointer. Okay, so now I say in East Asian Buddhism, now since the Great Dharani does come from a sutra that was translated into Chinese from Sanskrit, there is some prehistory of it going back in Indian Buddhism. And I believe that there is a version of the Dharani and the sutra that it comes from in Tibetan Buddhism as well, but I really don't know anything about that. And I don't know that anyone really has any knowledge of the Sanskrit original. But we are going to talk about this. It was mentioned in the last class, but I'll talk about it more in this class, the sutra that the Great Dharani comes from. So the sutra that it comes from was translated during the Tang Dynasty, fairly early in the Tang Dynasty by a guy named Bhagavad Dharma. And so here I'm calling it the Great Dharani Sutra. There's a much, much longer title to this sutra. And uh, which, let's see if I go back a couple of slides from. Here it is. This is the full title of the sutra that the Great Dharani comes from. A thousand hands, thousand eyes, Quan Xian, Bosal, vast, great, perfect, complete, without obstruction, great compassion, heart, Dharani Sutra. Okay. And this slide will be available. You can download it if you go to the YouTube video when this gets uploaded. It'll have a link to download the slides in the description. Okay, but so now you can see why I just call it the Great Dharani Sutra instead of whatever all that other was. And this was it's not known exactly when Bhagavad Dharma did this translation, but somewhere around 655 AD. So it's early in the Tang Dynasty. Now, late in the Tang Dynasty, there was a teacher named Yongming Yanshou. And actually, so he was born towards the almost the end of the Tang Dynasty. He lived after the Tang Dynasty ended in an independent kingdom called Wu Yue, and I'm going to talk about that. So we'll talk about Yongming and the kingdom of Wu Yue play a role in the history of the Great Dharani, along with Guangzhang, the king of Goryeo, which was the largest part of Korea at this time. Korea at this time was still divided into three main kingdoms, but Goryeo was the largest during this period. So that gets us up to, later in the 10th century. The Song Dynasty starts. These are its dates, 960 to 1127. Now, the Song Dynasty is where a guy named Sima Zhili comes along. And he's important because he was the first person to take the Great Dharani and use it to turn it into, he's the first person we know of, at least, who took the Great Dharani and embedded it into a longer, a more formal practice. As far as we know, before Zhili, people just chanted the Great Dharani. Now, there are some instructions in the sutra for a few preliminary practices that you're supposed to do before you chant the Great Dharani. But other than those preliminary practices, people would just chant Great Dharani. And one of the things we talked about in the previous class was that scholars wonder about why the Great Dharani was so popular in China. Sorry, my phone went off. Let's see if I can. Sorry, just a second. So it's interesting if you read Buddhist scholarship. Even Buddhist scholars who are themselves Buddhists, or at least who are sympathetic to Buddhism, or favorable towards Buddhism, which of course scholars are supposed to be very objective and aren't supposed to, if they are Buddhists, they're supposed to hide it, essentially. and so the one thing you won't find Buddhist scholars saying is that the Great Dharani became so popular because it works. Because that would be, and in fact, it's a difficult thing to prove. And yet probably the best evidence for the fact that the Great Dharani actually has some real benefit to it is its incredible popularity for centuries and centuries up to this day throughout China and Korea and Japan and Vietnam. Anyway, oh yeah, so here we are. Oh yeah, so Sima Zhili was a teacher about 1,000 years ago in China, And he thought, everybody's chanting the Great Dharani. It would be better for them to, it would be better to make it a more elaborate practice where we could put some more. Because if you're just chanting the Great Dharani, unless you, it's very difficult to make out any real meaning in the Great Dharani. And although it is possible to sort out what at least parts of the Great Dharani mean. For example, in the beginning, when we say Shinmyo Janggu De Dharani, that's the title of the text, and it actually has a meaning. It means the Great Dharani of mysterious and divine phrases, something like that. And then the next line, Shinmyo Janggu De Dharani, Namo Ra Dana Dara Ya Ya, that means homage to the three jewels. Okay, and it actually isn't that difficult to interpret that if you know. You don't even have to know any Sanskrit. You just have to know kind of how the Chinese approximation for the Sanskrit. That beginning is fairly commonly found in many different Dharanis. Anyway, so but at the same time, people were just chanting it just basically for good luck. To bring good luck, to bring good fortune, to get a better job, to get a better deal on their whatever their dealings are. Today, the chant today is extremely popular with students who chant it before a test. Anyway, so Gili wanted to make it a more Buddhist practice, not just a superstition, and put some more Buddhist content into it. So he created a much more elaborate ceremony that takes, at a minimum, probably 2 hours to do, but there's forms in which it takes 21 days to complete. So I'm going to talk more about Gili and his ceremony that he created. And let's see. Oh yeah, and then now we're getting up to about 1350. This is in Korea again. This is a book from Korea, The Five Great Mantras, which is a very popular book that has been continuously published and circulated in Korea since 1350 or so. And it's a collection of mantras, 5 mantras. In fact, some versions have an additional mantra in it, and the Great Dharani is one of them. Okay, so now in 1392, the dynasties changed in Korea, and what happened in the Joseon dynasty is that the Buddhists were on the outs, and so it's kind of interesting to read about the history of Buddhism during this period in Korea, because it was no longer, at the very least, it was no longer officially supported by the government. At times, it was actually somewhat persecuted. I mean, persecution by Western standards, fairly mild. People were not burned at the stake or tortured on the rack. They were just basically the monasteries were closed. And people were told to go get real jobs, basically. And that was actually what that was kind of the Confucianist attitude towards Buddhist monks and nuns, was that they should return to their families and get real jobs. That was kind of the critique of Buddhism at the time, that Buddhists were a drain on society, from kind of the rigid sectarian Confucianist standpoint. There's actually a long history in Korea of mixing or working together, or syncretism of Confucianism and Buddhism. But there's also some history of conflict between Confucianism and Buddhism. Okay, so Queen Insu was even though she lived during the Joseon dynasty, when Buddhism was officially criticized by the government, if not actually suppressed to some extent. She was a strong Buddhist and was very active in promoting Buddhism. And she worked very closely with a monk named Hakjo, which I'll talk about a little bit more. And one of the things that they worked together on was this book, The Five Great Mantras. Now, this book may have been in circulation as early as 1350, but by 1485 was the time period when Queen Insu and Hakjo were working together and promoting the Dharma. One of the ways that they were promoting the Dharma was by promoting the practice of mantra recitation and disseminating this collection of mantras. Okay, so in Yongming is the first main person I want to talk about. And before I talk specifically about Yongming, or in the Korean pronunciation of his name is Yongmyung, something like that. But he lived in this very interesting place down here. Let me zoom in on that a little bit. Actually, this is good zoom here. So you can see here's the later Zhou. So this is a big chunk of China right here. And in this area of China, Buddhism was at one point was rather severely suppressed. The monasteries were closed. And the reason for it was that the emperor of this region of China, so this was during a time when China was not unified. So all these separate, these are not just provinces of China, these are separate countries, all these little, including Wu Yue, which was the place where Yongming lived. But up here in the Zhou, the emperor of Zhou wanted copper. Their currency was copper coins. And so he decided that he was going to go and close all the Buddhist monasteries, take all of their statues, their bells, and melt them down to make currency. And any monks or nuns who refused to tell them where their statues and bells were was put to death. So that's in contrast to Wu Yue. So the kingdom of Wu Yue during this time was a relative, well, let's see, as the Tang dynasty disintegrated around 907, the independent kingdom of Wu Yue came into existence. And so this was a very, from the end of the Tang to the beginning of the Song dynasty was a very turbulent period in general. I mean, because all these different states were fighting with each other. Wu Yue was relatively stable and was able to defend itself and had a stable economy. And the rulers of Wu Yue were Buddhists and were very supportive of Buddhism. And in particular, they were supportive of probably the most famous Buddhist in their little kingdom, Yongming Yanshou. So Yongming Yanshou was a Zen master, and he's also considered to be important in the history of Huayan and Pure Land Buddhism. Now, because he was both a Zen master and also a scholar of Huayan. So Huayan Buddhism is the not necessarily a separate school of Buddhism, but it's just Buddhism that is strongly influenced by the Avatamsaka Sutra, which in fact, it really needs to be pointed out that all Mahayana Buddhism is strongly influenced by the Avatamsaka Sutra, especially, and Zen Buddhism in particular is very strongly influenced by the Avatamsaka Sutra. But if you get at certain points in the history of Buddhism in China, it's been considered to be a separate school for whatever reason. And of course, Pure Land Buddhism, Pure Land teachings are also very influential in all schools of Mahayana Buddhism, including Zen. But at certain times in the history of Buddhism in China and East Asia in general, if you get too close to the Pure Land school, you become suspect. So at least in retrospect, at the time, everybody thought Yongming was great. But in retrospect, in the later Song dynasty, a more of a purist view of Zen began to evolve. And Yongming began, in retrospect, was seen as someone who was not pure enough because he was a scholar of the Avatamsaka Sutra and a practitioner and teacher of Pure Land teachings. And just an example of this in modern day Buddhism, there's really a great book by Andy Ferguson, Zen's Chinese Heritage, which is a really one-stop shopping for studying the history of Zen, and history of Zen by way of studying the history of Zen teachers. Um, and so, of course, Andy has to have a chapter on or a section on Yongming, and he says Yongming's syncretic method of instruction presaged the wide dilution of Zen with other Buddhist schools that occurred as the Song dynasty proceeded. So, this is really unfortunate that Andy Ferguson says this. This is a very this is a very two-dimensional way of viewing Zen. That Zen should not be mixed with other teachings. If you look at the writings of Hakuin, um, who comes actually with fairly modern times. Hakuin does write about Yongming and does criticize Yongming in ways that are similar to what Andy Ferguson does in this book, but he also has a lot of positive things to say about Yongming and praises Yongming and recommends Yongming's writings to be read. So Hakuin is a little schizophrenic actually when it comes to Yongming, which is it's interesting. Anyway, so he was one of the things that Yongming was famous for, and this is getting back to the subject. He was famous for his very rigorous daily practice schedule, which he kind of published as a little manual for anybody who wanted to be a really hardcore Buddhist practitioner. He let people know what his practice was every day. And one of the things that was included in his practice was chanting the Great Dharani 6 times every day. So he was famous, like I said, he was extremely famous not only throughout China, but the king of Goryeo, this was Guangzhong, who ruled from 949 to 975. He was so impressed with Yongming that he sent 36 monks from Goryeo to go study with Yongming. And let's see, if we go back to that map there, you can see, here's Goryeo up here. This is Korea, and this is Huye. So I guess since they probably went by sea, I don't know the details of that, but 36 monks went to go study with Yongming in China, and all of them eventually returned to Goryeo, having received Dharma transmission from Yongming. And one assumes they all came back chanting the Great Dharani. Now, oh yeah, so this is a kind of an interesting little bit of, oh yeah, so okay, so we got 5 minutes before we need to take a break. Hong Mai was the author of this. This is the actual title of his book in Chinese. It's the record of, it's the record of Yi Jian. I'm not sure how you Yi Jian to mean the listener, but that's one of the ways it's been translated into English. But basically, it's a collection of stories of the supernatural. Okay, weird stories, ghost stories. Hong Mai was basically, he was a Confucian scholar, but he was also kind of a folklorist of his time. He collected stories, went around talking to people, and put together its huge collection of 2,692 stories. These are just the ones that survive. Only half of this book survives to this day. There were originally 420 chapters. There's only 206. But and like I said, he was a Confucianist. He wasn't a Buddhist. He wasn't particularly interested in promoting Buddhism, but of the stories that he collected, let's see, 49 of the stories that he collected were stories of Buddhists who chanted mantras and dharanis and reported miraculous results from their recitation of mantras and dharanis. And the mantra or dharani that was most often reported was the 12 cases of the invocation names of Buddhists. Okay, 11 times the Great Dharani was cited, as the mantra that resulted in some sort of, miraculous healing or miraculous ghosts were gotten rid of or whatever. Also, in 7 cases, people just chanted Guan Yin's name, which is basically they did Quan Si Bo Sao chanting. Quan Sambo Song, Quan Sambo Song, Quan Sambo Song. Um, and Oh yeah, and this is from a book by Richard McBride, who's a really interesting author. And this is a not an exact quote. I don't have it in quotation marks, but he says Dharanis used in Buddhist thaumaturgy, which is magic, basically, divination, merit making, healing practices, rituals, and the invocation of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas for the destruction of unwholesome karma, as well as in astrology and other occult sciences, were common features of Chinese Buddhism specifically and Chinese religion in general. Yeah. And so in that mix of, uh, uh, yeah, this is just interesting because this is a source by someone who isn't a Buddhist, who isn't particularly interested in talking about how popular the Great Dharani was, but in the course of collecting these kinds of stories of the weird and the supernatural, he reported on many cases of people reporting miraculous results from chanting mantras, Buddhist mantras and Dharanis, and in particular the Great Dharani. And so this is from, you know, he began collecting these stories in 1161, and the final finished collection was published in 1198. Okay, so this would be a good place to stop for a 5-minute break. And so I'm going to do that. And I'm going to, yeah, so we'll start a 5-minute break right about now. Was my sound still good? Okay. All right. So if there's any questions or comments or anything, like I said, at any time, please feel free to jump in and ask or say anything that comes to mind. I feel comfortable with this group saying that. um, so this is what is this is what I've got displayed here. Everybody can see this, right? The ritual of great compassion, repentance, and the domestication of the thousand-handed and thousand-eyed Kuan Yin in the Song, right? Now, this is a chapter from a really great book. Let me go, let's see, I'm on page 272, but um, this is from this book. Oh, come on. Let's see. Probably screwed that up. Yeah. Oh, yeah. All right, good. Oh, yeah. Kuan Yin, the Chinese transformation of Avalokiteshvara by Chen Fan Yu. All right. So um, this is the table of contents. And this chapter here, chapter 7, is a chapter about the Great Dharani. Now, you wouldn't necessarily know it just by looking at the title. The ritual of great compassion, repentance, and the domestication of thousand-handed and thousand-eyed Kuan Yin in the Song. Now, the relationship between the Great Dharani and this particular form of Kuan Yin or Avalokiteshvara with the thousand hands and thousand eyes is very strong. Um, let's see. Let's scroll all the way down here. Here we go. Yeah. Yeah. So that's one hint, but just because it's talking about the thousand-handed, thousand-eyed Kuan Yin doesn't it still doesn't tell us that we're talking about the Great Dharani. So what this repentance ritual is this is what I was referring to earlier. This fellow named Ji Li. I'm gonna go back. Let's see if I can bring back my slides. Ji Li, who created this ritual ceremony uh, for chanting the Great Dharani. And if you the yeah, and so if you look at the so I I know Elizabeth is familiar with the Thousand Hands and Eyes Sutra. I know Joe has heard me talk about it before. I don't know if you've ever chanted it. Yeah, yeah. Tom, I don't know if you have any familiarity with or experience with the Thousand Hands and Eyes Sutra. It's basically a 12 or 15 minute. In fact, I'm tempted to to play the recording that we have of it. Um, but what it is it's a long chant with the Great Dharani embedded in it. And the traditional way of doing this chant in Korean Buddhism is to do the Great Dharani several times, at least 3 times. Now, when Zen Master Sung San taught people the Thousand Hands and Eyes Sutra, he kind of gave us the short version. He said, do the chant with the Great Dharani just once, okay? But in Korea, it's much more common for people to do it 3 times, 6 times, 21 times, 108 times, all day, whatever. But the point is very much the same as what, in fact, the origins of the Thousand Hands and Eyes Sutra go back to uh, Ji Li and this ritual of great compassion, repentance. And if you look at the structure of the Thousand Hands and Eyes Sutra, a big section of the Thousand Hands and Eyes Sutra is basically the repentance section. So after, I think I actually had a slide on this last time. Let's see. Oh yeah, here it is. So this is still a very rough outline of the structure of the Thousand Hands and Eyes Sutra. The kind of the most important thing maybe is that right here is the Great Dharani. And so let's look at some of the things that go before the Great Dharani. So you have this opening, which is ends with this mantra Om Bada Mil, Om Bada Mil, which is just called the opening to the Thousand Hands and Eyes Sutra. After that comes the mantra to purify speech, which is the Suri Suri Mahasuri Susuri Sabaha mantra, which is very commonly that or something like it is often uh, uh, recited before doing any kind of sutra recitation. The mantra to console the gods of the five directions, which is it. It's not so much to console the gods of the five directions as to uh, uh, calm the energies, surrounding energies, to help create a nice, good environment for your sutra recitation. The sutra opening verse, which is not the same thing as the mantra, yeah, the sutra opening verse, the opening the Dharma treasure mantra, which is not the same as sutra. And then there are different names of Avalokiteshvara, which are all recited. And then there are 10 vows, which are taken from the sutra that the Great Dharani comes from. So even though this is called the Thousand Hands and Eyes Sutra, it's really kind of a yeah, it's a ceremony that then has been kind of elevated to the status of a sutra. But the actual sutra that the Great Dharani comes from does include these 10 vows. And then right after the 10 vows, another thing that's in the Great Dharani Sutra is several different things that the Great Dharani will protect you from. Then there's more names of Avalokiteshvara. And then another thing that is stated in the Great Dharani Sutra is to invoke the name of Amitabha as well, because Amitabha in the Great Dharani Sutra is presented as Avalokiteshvara's original teacher. And then you chant the Great Dharani. Then after chanting the Great Dharani, you get into the repentance section, which begins with some verses for cleansing the four directions. The repentance section ends with the chanting of the repentance mantra, which is Om Salva Mocha Moji Sadaya Sabaha. Right? That's right, isn't it? So that's if you've ever been to a precept ceremony in Korean Buddhism, that's the mantra that is being recited while people are getting their burn marks. So if you're if you've ever been to and not all teachers in the Korean Buddhist tradition still do the burn marks, and those that do, like Zen Master Degak, he always says, "Oh, it's optional. You don't have to." But in Korean Buddhism, it's believed that, well, I mean, this is sort of a folk belief in Korean Buddhism, that when you die and you meet Jijang Bosal, you're supposed to show Jijang Bosal your burn marks, and that the more impressive your burn marks are from all of your precepts, it's it's good to get on Jijang Bosal's good side when you are going through the Bardo. But that's kind of folk Buddhism, but it's an interesting story. Anyway, but that's the repentance section, and then there's a bunch of other stuff. So the repentance aspect of this ceremonial recitation of the Great Dharani is still included in. So there's a number of different things that are included in the Great Dharani. I mean, that are included in the Thousand Hands and Eyes Sutra. One of them shows this repentance aspect of it. Another one is that includes several things that are from the sutra, the Great Dharani Sutra. Another thing is that it has a big section on Junje Bosal, which culminates in the chanting of the Junjie Bosal mantra. Now, one interesting thing, before you get to the Junjie Bosal mantra in the Thousand Hands and Eye Sutra, there's another mantra that's related to Junjie Bosal. So the Junjie Bosal mantra is Om Jari Juri Junjie Sabaha Buddhim. Om Jari Juri Junjie Sabaha Buddhim. Um, the other mantra that's associated with Junjie Bosal is Namu Chogoji Bulmo De Junjie Bosal. And if you've ever heard of the one of the more famous koans, is the koan about the Zen master who would always hold up one finger, Guji. Does that ring a bell to people? Guji, sometimes called guti or gute in the Japanese tradition. And so people, so if you've ever heard the story of this koan, this Zen master would always hold up one finger, and he was very famous for it. People traveled from all over China and people would ask him, and this is if you ever had the opportunity to be someplace where Zen Master Sung San gave a Dharma talk or gave any sort of a public talk, people would ask, and then there was a chance for people to ask him questions. People would ask him, "What should I do with my life? Should I get married? Should I go to college?" You know, I mean, people bring their everyday ordinary problems. Uh, yeah, in addition to more spiritual, what might be considered more spiritual things. But no matter what people would ask Guji, he would just hold up one finger. And there was something about this one finger that Gucci that people, and so one day, Gucci was traveling, and his attendant, who was a young boy, was there, and somebody came and was very disappointed that Gucci wasn't there, and so the young boy said, "You know what? I think I can help you." So he put on Gucci's robes and sat on Gucci's, teaching cushions and said, "Go ahead, ask me anything." And so the traveler, asked the boy a question, and the boy just he'd seen Gucci do it a million times. He just held up one finger, and yeah, the traveler had a great awakening. And so when I've already made the story a little longer than I should have, but actually, if you read Zen Master Sung San's book, The Compass of Zen, he has the best version of this story in it, and it's much longer than the one I'm telling you. Basically, the guy leaves very satisfied. Gucci comes back, asks his attendant, "Did I miss anything?" And the boy said, tells him the story, and then Gucci cuts his finger off. And then, of course, the boy runs away, and Gucci calls out to the boy as he's running away, and the boy turns around, looks back, and Gucci holds up a finger. And the boy, at that point, attains enlightenment. So people tend to remember stories where Zen masters are cutting people's fingers off, breaking people's legs, things like that, hitting people. But the reason why he was called Guji was because this was his practice. He chanted Namu Choguji Bulmode Junjie Bosal. And this was his nickname. This was not his Buddhist name. This was not a monastic name. This was what people called him because this is what he did all the time. He chanted Namu Choguji Bulmode Junjie Bosal, Namu Choguji Bulmode Junjie Bosal. And Guji is the Korean pronunciation of the Sanskrit koti, which basically means a really big number. So Chilgu Ji Bulmo De Junjie Bosal means homage to the mother of 70 billion Buddhas, Junjie Bosal. Anyway, and so Junjie Bosal is a really big deal in East Asian Buddhism as well. And so having this as part of the Thousand Hands and Eye Sutra is considered really cool. It's kind of up there with the almost up there with the Great Dharani. Anyway, all right. Now, moving back to the timeline of history of the Great Dharani in East Asian Buddhism. Like I said, we can't really go back before when we know of the first translation of the Great Dharani Sutra. Oh, but one thing that is important to point out is that there's no reason to think that people weren't already chanting the Great Dharani before the sutra was translated. Most of the people that I know who chant the Great Dharani don't even know that there is such a thing as the Great Dharani Sutra that the Great Dharani comes from. So the two aren't necessarily tied to each other. This all I'm saying is that this isn't necessarily the starting date for the actual practice of chanting the Great Dharani in China. Okay, so we were up to talking about Hong Mai. Hong Mai was the guy who wrote this collection of weird tales, supernatural stories that happen to include several instances of people chanting the Great Dharani and experiencing miraculous results. So the next big point along the history of the Great Dharani, especially in Korea, is this book called the Five Mantras. Now, uh, let me go up to, oh yeah, there it is. The slide I have on um, Queen Insu. Uh, so Queen Insu was the she was actually she survived her husband. Her husband had been king, and she really became more prominent after her husband died. And so she was actually technically the Queen Dowager Soye, but for whatever reason, she's always referred to as Queen Insu, and she's uh, the main character in a very popular recent South Korean historical TV series. And this is based upon a theory about Insu that she actually was plotting to become the ruler of Korea in her own right, not just as the queen, which would have been extremely interesting if she had succeeded. And I don't know if there's any real historical evidence that she even had this intention, but um, had she succeeded, it would have made a huge difference potentially in Korean history because this was during a time when the Confucianists were in control, and these particular Confucianists, uh, had had an attitude about Buddhism, very negative attitude. Um, but even though she didn't, if she ever intended to, seize control and then use that power to promote Buddhism, she nevertheless used her position as part of the imperial family to give a great deal of protection, not just protection to Buddhism, but to promote Buddhism. So even though Buddhism during this time of Korean history wasn't supported by the government, there was a lot of publishing of Buddhist books. And also during this time, and this was something that Queen Insu was very involved in, was taking Buddhist writings and translating them into Korean. Now, the practice throughout the history of Buddhism in Korea has been for Korean Buddhists to use classical Chinese. Um, and so the sutras, the people, for the most part, did not translate sutras or other Buddhist writings into Korean. They would take either take writings from China and just bring them over, or even Korean Buddhist teachers themselves would write in Chinese. It was kind of like uh, French or Latin or any other example of a language that becomes like the 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 prestige language for scholars and intellectuals and aristocrats to use. That was the status of classical Chinese in Korea at the time. But Queen Insu and her, let's see, this guy named, what was his name? And the previous slide. Yeah, here it is. Insu and Hakjo was her kind of partner in crime in this. And it wasn't exactly criminal, but it was outside of what was really officially approved and promoted by the government. The anything that had to do with promoting Buddhism. So together, they, a lot of times when you read about the history of sutras in East Asia, there's a lot of emphasis placed upon when was the sutra when was the sutra translated into Chinese. But it's one thing for a sutra to be translated into Chinese. It's another thing for it to be printed and distributed so that it's available to people. And then if you're Korean, it's yet another thing for the sutra to then be translated into Korean using the Korean native script Hangul, um, so that mm, it, most Koreans at this time couldn't read Chinese. Most Koreans today can't read Chinese. But the Hangul script is actually quite easy to learn. Um, King Sejong, who is a little bit before this time, um, bragged that uh, a stupid person can learn Hangul in 10 days. He said a smart person can learn it in half a day, but a stupid person can learn it in 10 days. So anyway, so Insu and her monk accomplice, they both worked to have Buddhist writings published and circulated, and also then translated into Korean using the native Korean script. And one of the things that they published and circulated in particular was the book, The Five Great Mantras. And so in the one of those mantras was the Great Dharani. And so what they did was they didn't translate the Great Dharani into Korean. They transliterated it. So they sounded it out in the Hangul script, just like, which is just how I learned to, chant the Great Dharani. I didn't learn it in I was told this is the Korean version. This is in Korean when actually it's not. But it's just we just sound it out in. Let's see. Yeah, like when we say Shinmyo Janggu De Dharani, it's Shinmyo Shinmyo Janggu Gangu. That's just how we use our own alphabet just to make the sounds that approximate uh, um, the sound of the mantra, and you can do the same thing in the Korean native script. And so that's what Queen Insu did as her contribution, and she did a bunch of other stuff. She anyway, this is kind of a list of all the things that some of the things that she was involved in. And just one thing that I thought that was interesting in this, this is from another article by Richard McBride, which I've got a link to here with the full title if you want to. That Queen Insu was known for her let's see, the great importance that she put on the four extensive vows, the Sa Hong Won, which is the Korean way of saying the four great vows that we recite. Um, anyway, so that's, let's see. Oops. Okay. That's what I've got. Do people have, I would love to hear some questions or comments or, and one of the things that's important to know, and yeah, I should put more emphasis on this, is that the Great Dharani in Korean Buddhism is something that everybody does. It isn't something you just do when you go to the temple or go to a meditation group. People do it as part of their regular everyday practice. And that's how Zen Master Sung San did it too. Zen Master Sung San, his practice of the Great Dharani was to just do it all the time. Sometimes people would ask him, "Do you do it in your sleep?" He said, "Yes, of course." And I believe him. But he did it as it. The Great Dharani was his practice that he used as a young man to attain enlightenment. And then once he attained his great awakening, he continued to do the Great Dharani for the rest of his life. Um, now, if you are fortunate enough to be part of Zen Master Sung San's Dharma family or extended Dharma family, then you have that connection with it. But it's something that everybody in East Asia, or at least anybody who's a Buddhist, or I mean, you don't have to be that devout of a Buddhist to use the Great Dharani as kind of a good luck charm. People will make use of it. Anyway, questions or comments or
no, but very interesting. Very interesting.
we don't quite have. Yeah, Tom. I saw Tom unmuted.
I hope this isn't a deviation from the theme here. When you add up the thousand and the arm sutra there, one of the practices, if you will, one of the chants included in that toward the end there was Om Nam.
Yes.
And we've done that at Furnace Mountain, but I have never had a good explanation of Om Nam. Can you spend a minute on it?
Yep. Yeah. So there's two ways that the Om Nam chant is described, and so one of the cool things about all of these mantras, most of them, is that they have a title. Okay, so like a lot of times the mantras themselves are very difficult to make out any meaning. Often if you're lucky, you can figure out what the original Sanskrit is, and you can find what the meaning is for parts of a mantra at least. But inevitably, the titles of the mantras are just Chinese words that are, and so it's this is the mantra that, and so the Om Nam mantra is the mantra for purifying the universe. Okay, and so the Chinese tends to be a very condensed, especially classical Chinese tends to be very kind of succinct to the extent of being obscure, and even it's a stereotype to use this word, but inscrutable. But what does it mean, the mantra? So sometimes it says this is the mantra to purify the universe, and sometimes it said this is the mantra to connect with the original purity of the universe. That to understand that the universe is pure. Our perception of it is what's not pure, and so the Om Nam chant, helps us to cleanse our own, to purify our perception, so that we can see the universe in its true pure state. But which kind of makes sense to me, and I think it's interesting to hear different explanations of mantras and dharanis, in my opinion. You really have to do them. There's a great Japanese teacher, Kukai, who was a master. He was the founder of the Shingon school of Buddhism in Japan, which Shingon is Japanese for mantra. So he was, and he wrote a really interesting article on the Heart Sutra Dharani, the Gate Gate Paragate Parasam Gate Bodhisvaha. And he said the only way to really understand the Heart Sutra Dharani is just to do it, a million times. And then you will see what it means. And so that's the best, that's the best approach. But at the same time, it is interesting to know what it's supposed to mean, in words, even though ultimately the meaning is beyond that.
People like referred to it as the universal stain remover.
That's perfect. Yeah. And there is actually a much longer version of that mantra. So if you find out the title of the mantra and then you search the title of the mantra, you'll find much longer versions of it. But Om Nam it's wonderful because it's short. It's great, and it has Om in it. So yeah. So what else should we talk about the Great Dharani? I mean, not right now, but just anybody have any ideas or suggestions for the next class? Oh, so one thing I am, oh, go ahead, Elizabeth, please. Yeah, I saw you, Elizabeth. You had something. If you could,
yeah. We don't have to talk about this, but I do think one thing I liked that you mentioned in one of the other was the connection between Shiva and Avalokiteshvara.
Yeah. Okay.
Maybe we already talked about that, but I just wanted to say that.
Yeah. So Shiva and Vishnu and Harihara. Harihara, who is a Hindu god, who is a combination of Shiva and Vishnu. Those are all, they're all in the Great Dharani. So yeah. So yeah. So I didn't really have enough on that prepared tonight, but one of the things that I've been doing is that the Japanese Buddhism has a different version of the Great Dharani. It's the same chant essentially, but they've diverged over time. They've evolved, and they're like, you know, different breeds of you know, cat or something. And you can, and the Japanese version has been back translated into Sanskrit, and then you can reconstruct what its actual meaning is. And so there are large parts of the Korean version of the Great Dharani that correspond directly to the Japanese version, and you can look at those parts of the Korean Great Dharani, and you can say this is what it means. There's different, and one of the things that you find is different names of Shiva and Vishnu that are in there. Yeah. So that'll definitely be in the next class. Shiva, Vishnu, Harihara, and the Japanese version, the Great Dharani. Okay. So we've got time to do the Great Dharani one more time, which is what we should do. Okay. Oops. So thanks everybody for coming, and I will have this posted on YouTube in a day or two along with the slides. And now we'll end with the Great Dharani itself. I'll share my screen. Bye, everybody. Great to see you.
Thanks, Kurt.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks.